Okay, well, I'm in the middle of my Axis Empires game, but I didn't feel like playing right now. So, taking a step back to, well, it was the walk through history. Now it's become something of an ahistorical walk. And we're going to start off with some of the sort of modern games. By modern games, I mean sort of post-Cold War. A lot of these are more projected battles between, say, the Warsaw Pact and NATO. And to begin one of these off, there's Attack Sub, which was a cute little game. I know it's gotten fairly good ratings. I've given it a 5 of all things in mine. But it's a cute little card game simulating kind of submarine combat. You can have multiple subs out there. It was kind of neat design. Same guy, I guess, who did Up Front, which might be attractive to some people. I found it an interesting game, kind of fun to play, kind of like the something that's been on my mind recently, Down in Flames, Rise of the Luftwaffe, and that whole series. Another one, Canadian Civil War. Now this is kind of a funny one. This is a very abstract map where you're moving politicians around among their constituencies to get control of issues, businesses are getting involved in everything, and you're trying to get this collection of issues that you're aiming to win the game. But if you don't like where the game's going, you can declare a national emergency and try to throw Canada into a secession crisis, really. Central America, this is an old Victory Games game. Looked really, really exciting, The pretty map, great counters, all these different types of things like sending aircraft carriers down to different coasts in Central America. You could have one on each coast. You have the Soviet intervention forces. You have these generate your own scenario, which was kind of, to me, it was the epitome of the whole thing, but there were lots of sort of, hey, if you want to play an already, somewhat more balanced scenario, here's one that's a little fairer. All in all, though, it kind of fell flat. I've given it a 6. My friend Nick gave it a 9 for some reason. I'm not sure why. But this is one of those Victory games that draws you in with the rule book. It seems so exciting, and then when you actually start playing it, it just doesn't feel like there's that much story going on, which is the important part to me, and it didn't feel like there were that many decisions either. SPI's Central Front series. Now, this came out just towards the end of S&T and SPI's existence, really. Well, their ownership of S&T, because it went there. And it started out as 3 maps. And in the magazine, 5th Corps was the first one. Beor came out next. I picked up Hoff Gap after I got the Moves magazine that linked it in 5th Corps, and then Beor said, or maybe it was the Moves came afterward. I think the Moves came in the middle, and it kind of said, hey, we screwed this up because like the Reforger stuff wasn't completed, like the design in terms of the military's actual design of what it was going to do hadn't been completed yet. And then they had to figure out a new way of handling the counters and everything. A lot of it changed sort of in mid-style, and you can redraw counters to try to make up for it, or try to use some kind of mutant version of it, which is what I generally tend to do. Now, after this, I picked up 2 more recently. North German Plain, which was supposed to be the next one in the series and never got made, and then got made sometime long, long later in the 90s, I guess, and Danao Front. And they're supposedly part of the series, but they don't look like they have the same rules. From what I understand, from what somebody said, they're missing one of the key elements to this game. I don't know if this was the first game with it, but it had this, in fact, I'm pretty sure it wasn't, but it had this friction point concept, where you can push units as far as you like, but the first time you move them, they flip over, and they're a little tired. If they're flipped over, you can move them again in the same turn, but each time you move them then, they take a friction point. And they take these friction points in combat too, so it's kind of like losing tactical quality in the Great Battles of History games, except once you take 5 or whatever, you're stuck. And if you take more in combat, you're destroyed. But if you take more, you can't push your units any further once they're really tired or fatigued or whatever. Anyway, it was an interesting system, lots and lots of bookkeeping. Ended up feeling like this overwhelming attack when the Russians came in. Now, that was the first couple times I played it. And then I finally set it up out in my garage on this huge table. And it really actually doesn't take that big a table. I can use 3 of my little modulars and get these 3 set up. And it would be so much better because I could just walk around and reach everything. But the only table I had that fit it was just tremendous size thing. And I set them all up on it, and I'm crawling around on the table. And I played it over the course of a couple months in the summer. And I got fairly deep into the game. And then later I played some of the one-map scenarios a little deeper. And, you know, there does come a point where the U.S. is able to hold the line in this one. Okay, Victory Games Cold War. This was a really light game, sort of playing cards, cutting deals, moving pieces around. We'll get this to the table and on video at some point, there's no question. And this was a lot of fun, but didn't feel anything like the Cold War, because for one thing, it's 4-sided, you know. I mean, if you want something Cold War, you want Twilight Struggle. This isn't it. There's a number of games of this flavor. Okay, what about Fifth Fleet? I have a bunch of the fleet games. Fifth Fleet in particular is the Indian Ocean, and it's kind of weird because it overlaps a couple of the fleets. It doesn't really exist, I think. But these were really, really detailed. And you'll see this level of detail in Central America. You'll see it in Gulf Strike. I'm sure in the Aegean Strike, or Aegean Strike, sorry. And again, they really excite you when you read the rules, when you look at the components, when you see the complexity level. But then actually playing them, again, you back off and you say, you know, there's just a little too much here. Too many decisions in this case, as opposed to Central America, because there are a lot. At least for me, there were too many decisions. It didn't feel like the kind of game that I really like. I'll probably get videos of this up, but I'm not going to go through and play every scenario. First of all, there are a lot of scenarios in it. Flashpoint Golan, not Gonad. That's what we called it, Flashpoint Gonad. Along with the Great Hot Gap from the Central Front series. Okay, Flashpoint Golan. This again, another Victory Games attempt. This is a Mark Herman game, actually. Really, really intense on the electronic countermeasures. Very detailed, very complex handling of it. Feels really good, except it felt a little too far to be playable. And, you know, so many of their games pushed me a little beyond my limit. That may be the point. I can handle a lot of complicated games. Maybe the interactive, these new concepts in gaming that were coming out in the Victory Games thing, which I really respect them for and love their games all the more for, but they didn't get a lot of playtime from me. And here's another one, another Mark Herman game for that matter, and I thought so. This is Gulf Strike. Sets up a bunch of scenarios that are essentially either, well, there's sort of 3 different kinds, but the main ones are going to be U.S. versus Soviets in the Persian Gulf. But there are other ones that have to do with the Arab League against one or the other side. In general, though, the superpowers have so much of an advantage in terms of what kind of resources they can bring to bear, especially in terms of support units, but even just in terms of mere supply. One of the more interesting scenarios from my point of view, because this suffers from the same thing a lot of the Victory Games games suffer from, and I love them to death, and I love the company, but the games just don't quite do it in so many cases. I mean, some of the historical stuff holds up a lot better than these modern things. But one of the more fun scenarios was, and I've rated this a 3, was the Iran-Iraq War, where you could almost do nothing because of the supply situation. Here's a little fun one, Kremlin. I don't have the expansion that gives you the historical Lenin period. I've got sort of the modern, more Brezhnev period, where that actually is the guy who's on top, and his hobby is waving to the troops. This is a lot of fun, a really silly, lighthearted look. You get to, your goal is to basically get somebody into the premiership or whatever. I'm not sure if that's the actual position. Obviously, premier goes along with it. I think it's party chairman is the actual one. And wave to the troops 3 times. And if you do that, you win the game. But you have to worry because sometimes your job doesn't go with your personality, and that makes you feel bad, and you don't do as well in your job. And sometimes, and you control multiple characters possibly. These characters are controlled by a bidding system. You put secret points on all the different characters, and so you don't necessarily know if you're promoting your own people or someone else's until these bids are revealed. Now, they're revealed during play so that you can control the character. You put a bid down on somebody so you can promote someone else or whatever. It's a cute little game, nothing really too serious about it. NATO, this is another Victory Games game, the next war in Europe. This was the game for Third World War for me. This was the European front done at a level that was playable, felt perfect. There's only one problem with it. Once you start rolling with those Soviet Unions, and this is, to me, different from the Central Front series, they're almost unstoppable once they unleash their chemical weapons and start attacking. So what happens? Well, the NATO player decides to nuke them. And that brings the game to a 50-50. You roll the die. Because half the time it's going to start World War III, and the NATO player loses. And the other half the time, they can stop the Soviets dead in their tracks with tactical nukes. And it doesn't really matter that the Soviets get a second strike, because you've taken out most of their nuclear capability, and you've stopped their headquarters and their troops. Alternatively, you could try to fight it out, which is certainly a more interesting game, but I've found that the edge with the chemical weapons puts it into the Russian hand. What would be a more interesting little modifier to it might be, hey, if the Russians don't use chemicals, make the risk higher for ending the war in World War III. And if they do, make it maybe lower. So maybe make it, give the Russians an incentive not to use the chem weapons. Another one I played, I believe on video, and I also played it with my wife. This is Pandemic by Z-Man. She loved it, absolutely loved it, and I thought it was a pretty good game. You can see the video, obviously. There's another one, SPI South Africa. This was the only Grogner challenge I ever won, I think. I may have won one other. But it happened to be at a time, and this is part of the reason I tried to win, when they were offering free games. And they were offering one, I don't remember, somebody donated their whole collection of SPI S&Ts. And this was one I didn't have, and it came up on something I had the question from. Not a terribly good game. Kind of simple, light, but hey, what the hell. I've got Milton Bradley's Summit. Now, I don't have this here, sadly. It's a huge box, and I'm missing the rules to this sucker. But the cards kind of tell you most of the rules, but not quite all of them. I may be missing some other pieces as well. It seemed to be a game where you put economic, political, military power into place to try to control countries. And once you got control of them, you could score points by cards coming up. It kind of has a lot of a prototype of what ends up going into Twilight Struggle, without really feeling like the CDG. And again, it's this multi-sided, not Cold War, but in that sort of era and that sort of mindset. If you played it 2-player, which it doesn't even support, it only supports 3-player because of the alliance rules, etc. If you played it 2-player, if you could get away with that, and you ended up, you played U.S. versus Russia, you would have something kind of similar to the Cold War. But it doesn't play that way, and it's meant to be played with up to 6 people. kind of a rollicking thing. And I don't know, it's an interesting game, but it doesn't really fit a historical period. It's kind of like playing something like Diplomacy, which pretends to be World War I era, or Risk, which doesn't seem to pretend to be anything. Superpower. This is Games Workshop, and like almost all Games Workshop games, it's not really a lot of fun. But this one's basically Monopoly. You move around the board, you collect countries, except that it's much, much longer and harder than Monopoly in terms of to finish the game. Basically, you have to get all the properties out, and getting the last few is really, really tough the way it works. It's got some interesting little mechanics. It was kind of fun, but we never figured out a way to, somebody suggested dealing out the properties. That wouldn't work very well. There were other things that just didn't work there either. Okay, Tom Clancy's Politica. This was a terrible component game. Component-wise, this game just sucked. What you had, these tiny little, I don't have it here, these tiny little pieces they cut out of tiny little slivers of paper to indicate control and stuff like that. I remember it being a vaguely interesting game. It holds up to 8 people, which is kind of neat. And it's not terribly complex, but it just didn't have a lot going for it. So I'm passing on giving much more information. All right, that is the modern period. And I'm going to send this one up so that I can get other periods up.